Hello, and welcome to the GreenBiz studio. I'm John Smieja, Vice President of Circularity here at GreenBiz, and I'm excited to welcome Sarah Haley to the GreenBiz studio. Sarah is a Senior Advisory Manager at Deloitte, focused on the banking and financial services sectors. Sarah, great to see you, and welcome to the GreenBiz studio.
Thanks, John. Thanks for having me.
So, I understand that your work at Deloitte with the Forest Stewardship Initiative has been thinking about the nexus of climate, nature, and Indigenous peoples. Can you tell us a little bit about what led to that work?
Sure. We've really come to this work through two main pathways. The first is through our own research on what it means to be nature positive in financial services. A couple months ago, we published a paper called The Nexus Between Climate, Nature, and Indigenous People, which really explores the connection and the overlap between a climate strategy, a nature strategy, and a commitment to honoring and respecting Indigenous peoples and Indigenous land. And through this research, what we found is that there's about 476.6 million Indigenous peoples worldwide. And this represents about 5% of the world's population. However, Indigenous peoples steward nearly 25% of Earth's lands and seas and protects about 80% of global biodiversity. And studies show that when Indigenous people have the right to govern in their land, biodiversity increases and forests are protected, which results in natural capital also being preserved. And this can help with climate change impacts, controlling, mitigating climate change, and also increasing climate resiliency of communities and economies. The second is a lot of clients have asked, what does nature mean for them and for their strategy? And there are several banks operating in the US and globally that have released commitments to honoring Indigenous peoples, Indigenous land, First Nations heritage, and their right to free, prior, and informed consent whenever there's a project or any land development that impacts their land and their identity. But there seems to be a disconnect because we can't put forth a commitment to Indigenous peoples without also putting forth a commitment to nature, because they really are one and of the same. And so this has really led us to think about, what does a robust and effective nature strategy mean for financial institutions? And in order to implement that and to design that strategy, we really need to think about how nature overlaps with climate and Indigenous peoples, because the connectivity there is really quite robust and quite pronounced.
Wow, yeah, and it might seem obvious to folks that climate and nature go hand in hand, but it sounds like we have to be intentional about it. I'm wondering if you could put some numbers to this. What are the risks of not considering human rights and nature in this climate work?
Sure, absolutely. Right now, it's estimated that there's about $44 trillion of economic value that relies on nature. So about 50% of financial securities worldwide are directly linked back to natural capital. And so the cost of inaction, of doing nothing, of not protecting nature, of not addressing the biodiversity crisis and the collapse of ecosystem services amounts to about $2.7 trillion a year. So that's about $2.6 trillion that the world's 50 biggest banks have invested since 2019 in loans and other projects that are really coming from sectors that are the primary drivers of nature loss. And in addition to that, there's about $711 billion that needs to be spent each year to reverse the decline in biodiversity by 2030. So not only is this a conversation about managing risk, it's also a great opportunity for banks to fulfill their sustainable finance goals and to put forth innovative financing and projects that are focused on addressing this need and helping to reverse biodiversity loss.
Yeah, so it sounds like banks do have a huge role to play in correcting the wrongs of the past and sort of living up to our environmental commitments and the need to preserve cultures and cultural spaces.
Yep, absolutely. And the other thing that's important to note is that First Nations were really the first communities to implement nature-based solutions. We hear a lot about nature-based solutions and how they're not only vital for a nature positive strategy, but they're also really important for a climate strategy because the co-benefits there are pretty vast. And when you have a strong nature strategy, it's just going to make your climate strategy even stronger. But Indigenous peoples were really the first communities to put forth these solutions. So, for example, they were the first to deliberately set fire to areas of the forest to prevent destructive, like uncontrollable wildfires. And they also pioneered most of the sustainable agricultural practices that we know of today, such as crop rotations. So not only is this a conversation about protecting heritage and human rights, but it's also about turning towards the individuals and that land-based knowledge that can help us solve this crisis, because they really are the pioneers on how to implement nature-based solutions that are effective.
All right, so Sarah, this is all really great information. Where should banks start, though, to have the most impact now?
That's a good question. And I think that there isn't one answer that is going to work for every organization, every financial institution. I think it really matters what types of products and services you offer and where you are on this journey, and especially what you're doing around climate, because there is a lot of opportunity to add a like biodiversity net gain program to different land development projects, renewable energy projects that are just a really quick add, and the additional investment is pretty minimal. But I think overall, you need to divide their opportunities into two main buckets. The first is understanding when projects and different investments in sectors that notoriously have negative impacts on nature impact Indigenous peoples, and making sure you have the right policies and teams in place to conduct due diligence, making sure that free, prior, and informed consent is honored, the tribe is consulted, and they are able to participate in the oversight and understanding what are the impacts of that project, both positive and negative. The second bucket is tailoring your financing solutions specifically for Indigenous peoples. So this could include land claim financing and infrastructure financing programs as well. There's some really cool pilots out there that are mobilizing private capital that can really help reverse certain areas that have high biodiversity value, that like trends of habitat and biodiversity loss that's happening. But the key there is that you need to make sure that you have project management and oversight that is coming from Indigenous peoples who are really the stewards of natural capital. So this needs to be an outcome that happens through Indigenous peoples, not to them. And so that stakeholder engagement and really making sure you have buy-in and that they're at the table helping you make decisions is really important.
Wow, that's a great advice, Sarah. Thank you so much, and thank you for your time today. You just heard from Sarah Haley, a senior advisory manager at Deloitte. Have a great day, and thanks for joining us in the GreenBiz studio.